Boy, I've been watching immigration for a long time because I grew up in South Texas. So this is a really, really interesting presentation we're going to hear today. And I want you to listen up because it's important. What's going on? Just what is going on at the border today, the U.S.-Mexican border? We're told one thing sometimes, we're told another. It's kind of confusing when we're not actually on the front lines. But our speaker today, Careen Shannon, has been on the front lines, up front and personal. And she's here to share that with us. She has documented that in an award-winning film, and I mean already about 10 awards, and it hasn't even debuted formally in Mexico yet, but shortly, we hope here. Las Abogadas, Attorneys on the Front Lines of the Migrant Crisis. She has practiced immigration law for more than 30 years. She was a full partner at Fragomen, the largest immigration law firm in the world. And she's been a professor. She's authored and co-authored hundreds of articles and books. And she is an expert on not just our immigration situation, but the global immigration crisis. She's now on the board of the Latin American Relief Fund, which of course most of us in this room know is supporting ABBA House, the migrant shelter in Celaya. You most recently heard about them with their new program to establish a new center just for the amputees, because these people mostly are coming up from the lower border of Mexico. They're riding La Bestia, which is a horrible train that they have to climb on top of. It has been said that 100% of the people who ride that train are violated, which is a nice word for a much nastier crime. So many of them fall off, they take themselves off and they lose their limbs. So this is a really big deal here in central Mexico, pardon me. And I want you to help me welcome Careen Shannon.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. Buenos días y gracias por venir. I am going to show you some slides, if I remember how this works. Plus sign, Diego? Okay, so I'm calling this Asylum Denied as I'm talking about what's happening on the border, because that is what's happening on the border, is that genuine asylum seekers are being denied their right under U.S. and international law to apply for asylum. I should maybe take this off so I can stand aside from the slide. Okay. No funciona. I'm going to start by giving you just a little overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about what asylum is. You probably think you know what asylum is, but there might be some nuances about which you're not aware. Okay. So which one?
Yeah, I think you have to point that thing towards you.
Okay, so I'll point it toward the laptop. And then I'll talk a little bit about the existing border restrictions that many of which started during the Trump administration and have continued during the Biden administration. And current conditions at the border, the people that are actually stuck there waiting to apply to come into the United States. The Biden administration has proposed some new border restrictions, and I'll talk about that a little bit. A little bit about Albergue ABBA, but I guess this audience knows about the shelter in Celaya, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. And I'll give you a little sneak peek of Las Abogadas, the documentary that Robert mentioned. If you could give me the signal when I have about 5 minutes left, that would be helpful. Let me try this again. Okay. So what is asylum? Asylum, as you probably know, is a type of humanitarian protection that people have the right to apply for basically in any country in the world. And it protects you from being deported, from being sent back to your country, and can offer other protections. In the United States, we've signed on to a UN treaty and have incorporated into our law the grounds on which you can qualify for asylum. So you can't qualify for asylum just because you say, I want asylum, I'm afraid, I can't go back to my country. You have to show that you have already been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future if you were forced to go back to your country on the basis of 5 very specific grounds. On the basis of your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, and then there's a catch-all category called membership in a particular social group. You'll notice, for example, sex or gender were not part of the list. So at least in the United States, particular social group has been used for asylum claims for women, for LGBTQ people, for other groups that don't qualify under race, religion, nationality, or political opinion. How do you actually apply for asylum? Well, in the United States, you have to be in the United States physically to apply for asylum, right? So it's kind of, people think, why don't you go to the U.S. Embassy in your country and apply for an asylum visa? There's no such thing as an asylum visa. You have to be physically present in the United States. It doesn't matter how you got there. You can't have arrived on a plane. You can go through an official port of entry at a land border. You can jump the fence. Once you're in the United States physically, whether you enter legally or illegally, you're entitled under U.S. law to apply for asylum. So one of my pet peeves is when people say, why don't people just do it the right way? Well, that is the right way. Even going in illegally, when what's happening now is people are going in illegally if they can't get in through a legal port of entry, and they're turning themselves over to the Border Patrol and asking for asylum. Immigration in the United States has changed over the years. It used to historically be mostly single Mexican males who were entering the country seeking work. Nowadays, it is overwhelmingly people seeking asylum, and many times it's family units. It's not necessarily single adults. So that's kind of your Asylum 101. Any questions? There will not be a test. And this is the legal framework at the border today. So there is this program that was one of the first things Trump rolled out when he took office after the infamous Muslim ban, was the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP. And to my mind, this is kind of an Orwellian name because it didn't protect anybody. But this is also colloquially known as the Remain in Mexico program, and this was the policy under which people showing up at the U.S.-Mexico border seeking asylum have to remain in Mexico while they wait to have their chance to argue their case before an immigration judge. That can take weeks or months or years before you get that chance, that hearing. And what has resulted, as I think most of you probably know, is that tent camps have grown up along the border where people are staying in the most dangerous part of this country, right? Those northern border cities that are cartel controlled. People are routinely kidnapped and held for ransom, sometimes subjected to worse fates than kidnapping. And that is a direct consequence of U.S. immigration policy. And when I say policy, it's not a law. Congress hasn't done anything about immigration in years. This is not a statute, it's not a regulation, it was simply a policy that was rolled out by the Trump administration. Early on in the Biden administration, the White House did try to lift MPP. They were sued by a coalition of states led by your wonderful state of Texas, and they were not allowed to lift it. It went up and down to the Supreme Court a couple of times. It was finally lifted, but it took quite some time. And I have to say, I think the Biden administration only half-heartedly fought it because they're worried about what happens when the border opens again, right? But MPP has now been lifted. However, Title 42 has not. Title 42 is a broad public health statute, and it doesn't just apply to the border. For example, the public health emergency that was declared in the United States during the COVID pandemic, that was based on Title 42. But what the Trump administration did was impose an obscure clause of Title 42, and I say obscure because I think it was only been imposed once before in history since the law was passed in the late 1800s. But this permitted the government to prohibit migrants from coming into the United States on the ground that they might be vectors of communicable disease. And the language around that has always bothered me because we tend to then hear talk about migrants as vectors of disease, as invaders, as a scourge, as these dehumanizing ways of talking about human beings. The fact is that this was a convenient way to shut down the border. I think we all know that COVID did not come into the United States from Mexico, right? That's not how it happened. And there are other ways to prevent disease from coming in with people, like requiring vaccinations or testing. So this was not a necessary measure with regard to COVID, but it turned out to be a very convenient measure as a way of closing the border. And then I just want to talk about something called humanitarian parole. this use of the word parole is different from the way you're used to hearing it. It has nothing to do with the criminal justice system, but it's a way in which the government can allow people to come into the United States temporarily, even though they don't have a proper visa or a green card or a U.S. passport. Title 42 itself has a specific parole provision for vulnerable people. So people that were in need of coming in because of health care or because they were in danger waiting in Mexico while they were waiting for their hearing before an immigration judge, they could apply for an exemption to Title 42 to come into the United States. Title 42 is still in place. Once again, the Biden administration tried to lift it. They were sued. It went up to the Supreme Court. They were not allowed to lift it. Now that litigation is on hold, though, because the administration has announced that they're going to lift the public health emergency on May 11th. And by operation of law, Title 42 itself will expire when that happens. So Title 42 is still in place at the moment, but it will be lifted shortly. So that's the legal framework. And now I'm going to talk about the actual conditions at the U.S. border. These are pictures that haven't been published anywhere. They're from a WhatsApp group of lawyers and other advocates that are volunteering in Matamoros and Reynosa, and they show the horrible conditions that people are still living in. You know, these are not official refugee camps. The United Nations isn't there. The Mexican government, the U.S. government really are not doing anything. These are people that are living under tarps. They're living in abandoned buildings. There's no electricity, there's no running water, there are open pits of human waste. This is how we are forcing, we, as in the U.S. government policy, forcing people to live for weeks, months, or years at a time while they wait for their chance to ask for asylum. On the right is a line of people at one of the pedestrian bridges, I think in Reynosa, who have gotten an appointment to come into the United States. And I'll talk about that process in a minute. But every day there are lines and lines of people like that trying to get in legally. If you're Ukrainian, you don't have to stay in a tent, right? If you're, in fact, for the Ukrainians, there was famously a period of time where a lot of people were showing up in Tijuana, and there was literally a special door opened up in the wall for them to come in. Recently, a program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans was rolled out. So in all these cases, citizens of these countries can apply to legally come into the United States to seek asylum. They're paroled in, so once again, it's not a pathway to a green card or citizenship, but it is a temporary permission to come into the country and then apply for asylum or find some other way to legalize their status. But they have to have a qualified sponsor, and that means a U.S. citizen or permanent resident or somebody else who is legally in the United States. They have to show they have the financial means to help support the person. They have to go through deep background checks. And this is for people who are not yet out of their country. So if you're a Cuban who has made your way to Mexico, you can't do this. You have to apply from Cuba. Why these countries? Ukraine, I think it's obvious. The other countries are countries that are deemed to be under authoritarian regimes where we know there's a lot of people coming out seeking legal status elsewhere. And there was also, from my understanding, an agreement between the U.S. and Mexican governments that when Title 42 is lifted, and people are going to try to start streaming into the United States is going to try to push people back. Mexico doesn't have the capacity to absorb all these people. And especially with regard to the Cubans and Venezuelans, where the U.S. has no diplomatic relations with those countries, they don't want their people back. So they would have no choice but to be sent back to Mexico. Mexico doesn't want that. So the U.S. decided to create this new program for the Cubans, the Haitians, the Nicaraguans, and the Venezuelans. But again, they have to be sponsored by a U.S. citizen or other legal resident. For everybody else, except those countries that I just mentioned, there's now an app called CBP One, and this is what you use if you're on the Mexican side of the U.S. border to try to make an appointment to then be able to speak to an officer at the port of entry to argue that you have a credible fear of persecution in your home country, you should be allowed to come into the country to apply for asylum. Now, think about it. We're talking about people living under tarps on the streets, and we expect them all to have a smartphone and to have Wi-Fi access and to be technologically savvy enough to use an app, which, like all apps, especially if you run a business, whenever you run out something new in technology, it's always glitchy at first, right? There are bugs, there are updates, it takes a while before it works seamlessly. This was rolled out at the end of January, and every day there are error messages along the lines of the screenshots I took there, where people are not able to get the app to function properly. One particularly egregious issue has been that you have to take a picture with your phone to start the process of securing an appointment. Turns out facial recognition software is made with a white face as a model. And if you have brown skin, or particularly if you have very dark skin, it doesn't necessarily work. So the Haitian immigrants, for the first several weeks of this rollout, were not able to use CBP1 because their pictures were not accepted. Then even once they adjusted that a little bit, you have to take a picture when you first apply. Then once you get a confirmation notice, you have to take another picture. It was being rejected because the second picture didn't match the first picture. So people were having to go find what shirt they were wearing the first time they took a picture and stand against the same wall so that it looked like them again. Or if you're a family, you have a baby, and you can't get the baby to sit still to take a picture, it wasn't capturing the faces of the babies. There are also limited numbers of appointments every day, and they get filled up very quickly. So it's a kind of appointment lottery, which just doesn't seem like the kind of situation where you should be using a lottery, but that's really what's happening. Also, people in places like Matamoros and Reynosa were getting appointments in Ciudad Juarez or in Tijuana. The last thing you want to have to do is try to travel that dangerous border area to get to Juarez, of all places, So the other thing is that there are always bad actors trying to take advantage of migrants, unfortunately. And these are just a couple of recent examples I've seen. About 10 days ago, there was a rumor in Juarez that the border was open and the U.S. was letting everybody in. And so migrants rushed the border, the actual official gateway, to try to get into the United States. Of course, that wasn't true. And it's never clear why these rumors come about. Probably there are going to be people there ready to take advantage of migrants who thought they were getting in, and they're so frustrated. So they're, oh, you want me to pay you $5,000 to help me get in? Sure. You want to guarantee that I'll get a green card? Sure, I'll pay you whatever you say. On the right side, you can't really read it, but there was a message that people were getting in their phones. I'm not sure how these bad actors got people's email addresses, but they were duplicating the logo of the actual agency, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and saying, oh, you don't have a sponsor for a parole program? We'll help you. Just pay us $3,000 and we will find a U.S. citizen to sponsor you. These kinds of things happen all the time. There was a priest, or somebody who was purporting to be a priest, who was walking around the camp in Matamoros telling people that he could help people, for a fee, of course. The U.S. government made very clear when they rolled out the CBP1 app that it's a free app, that you don't need a lawyer, that you don't need to pay anybody to use it. But frustrated people who are not able to get it to work, of course, are going to be susceptible to people saying, I can help you, you just have to pay me. So, current conditions, as I mentioned before, Title 42 is still in place, but expiring soon. So the administration has floated some ideas publicly about what it will do when that happens, because they're worried about a rush on the border, and rightfully so. There have been about 200,000 people a month coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. And conversation for another day maybe is why that is. I mean, why are there these huge numbers of people fleeing countries? It's not just the Northern Triangle countries anymore in Central America, as it had been for the last few years, but we're seeing people from Africa, from the Middle East, who are making their way to the U.S.-Mexico border. How do they do that? They typically fly to Ecuador, because Ecuador doesn't require visas for people from most countries. They're then making their way often on foot, often with their families, with children, through Colombia, through the dangerous Darien Gap, up through Central America, through Mexico to get to the U.S. border. So understandably, of course, the administration is worried about how to handle that flow. So one thing they have said they might roll out is a third country asylum requirement, or you might have seen it in the press as an asylum ban. This is something Trump had tried as well and was pushed back by the courts. This would be a requirement that if you have shown up at the U.S.-Mexico border asking for asylum, we're not going to even entertain your request unless you have tried to apply for asylum in the first country that you passed through on your way and were rejected. Now, think about how that works. So you're coming up through Ecuador, and you're going through Colombia and Panama and Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala. You were supposed to have applied where, in Ecuador? Or let's say you're from Honduras and you're trying to flee the MS-13 gang, and the first country you pass through is Guatemala. Well, guess what? MS-13 operates there too. You're still not safe there, and Guatemala doesn't really have much of a functioning asylum program, so it's not really a viable option. But the U.S. is saying that if this policy is implemented, although I'm hoping it would be pushed back by the courts again, that we will not allow you to apply for asylum unless you've applied and been rejected in Guatemala or in Mexico. Now, a lot of people are applying for asylum in these other countries, I should mention. It's not just the U.S. that's seeing this inflow of asylum seekers. All the countries in Central America have seen an uptick in asylum applications, as has Mexico. And I've met many people when I've gone to the shelter in Celaya who were pushed back from the U.S. border who said, Mexico doesn't seem like such a bad option, and maybe I'll apply here instead. Excuse me. There was also, I think of it as a kind of trial balloon that the administration sent out, some talk of saying that if you have entered the United States illegally, we will not allow you to apply for asylum. And I mentioned before that right now the law says it doesn't matter how you got into the country, you're entitled to apply for asylum once you're on U.S. soil. So this would require a statutory change, which good luck in Congress getting any statutory change passed, but this is something that they have floated. And finally, and this to me and to some of my friends here who worked in this area is the most heartbreaking. They're talking about possibly detaining asylum-seeking families. This is something that had happened in past years. Under George W. Bush, it had been stopped. Under Obama, it was started up again and continued through the Trump administration, where families that were apprehended would be held in these detention camps. If a mother, father, and children came through, they would separate the father out, send him to a detention center for men, and put the mother and young children together. And I've been in these places. I spent weeks volunteering in Dilley, Texas, and Karnes, Texas, and Artesia, New Mexico. And children don't belong in jail. I think of these as baby jails. It's just heartbreaking what can happen to the family unit when a mother and her children are being held in prison-like conditions. They paint pretty pictures on the wall, but they're still prisons. So these are things that the Biden administration is considering that may replace Title 42 when it's lifted. And one thing I meant to mention before, asylum is different under U.S. law than coming in as a refugee. We have a refugee resettlement program, and that's like, let's say you're a Syrian refugee and you've escaped to Turkey and you're in an official refugee camp overseen by the United Nations. You can then apply to be vetted by the UN and by the United States or by other countries to come in as a refugee. That's a very different process than people that have crossed the border and are applying for asylum. And by the way, if you come in as a refugee, you also get certain services, you get subsidies. You don't get anything like that when you apply for asylum. So just briefly, I understand you know about Albergue ABBA. What's really significant about ABBA, first of all, is its location, because it's near an important crossroads of that famous train line where people have to decide if they're heading up toward Tijuana or maybe Nogales or Juarez or Reynosa. So that's why the shelter is ideally placed, because there are a lot of people in that area looking to get on a train line who hear about the shelter and say, oh, there's a place I can go get some rest and respite and some food for a couple of nights. And then, of course, as you all know, Pastor Ignacio, I'm not a religious person, but I have no hesitation in saying that this man is a saint. He has just devoted his life to this cause. He and his family have worked tirelessly for years on behalf of migrants. The picture on the left is Pastor Ignacio with some members of the caravan that came through this area in 2018. They do incredible work, and they are the only shelter in Mexico that is certified by the Red Cross to help amputees get through the medical process, where they often have to have surgery and rehabilitation and be fitted for prostheses. And the picture on the upper left, the man standing with his back toward us is Stan Allen, who you may know as well. He has a GoFundMe campaign, and he uses those funds to buy food for the shelter. So he basically provides all the meat and other food that the kitchen uses to cook meals for the migrants. He buys shoes and socks. If you've walked thousands of miles across many countries, shoes and socks are some of the first things that you need and that people ask for. You can see some of the people who have suffered amputations by falling from that terrible train, who are getting care there. Bottom left corner is Rebecca Eichler, who is one of the featured abogadas in our film, and she volunteers at the shelter frequently and consults with the pastor on cases where he needs some advice on the legal case for people that are heading toward the United States. I'm going to take advantage of the invitation to share a little bit about our movie, and Diego, if you want to play the trailer, it's just about a 3-minute trailer. You'll get an idea of what the movie is about.
When Trump was elected, we all knew it was going to be bad, but we had no idea how bad it would get, and we had no idea how quickly it would get so bad.
We don't know if they're murderers, if they're killers, if they're MS-13. We're throwing them out by the hundreds.
Trump was describing them as invaders, and he was sending the National Guard to the border.
I have ordered another 3,750 troops.
I think the first group of caravan people, there was like 5,000 migrants in the first caravan, and there was 4 of us lawyers, and we were telling them what we could. You can't be surrounded by all that misery and pain.
When the Trump administration announced its policy of zero tolerance,
The United States will not be a migrant camp.
and that week, family separation had exploded. The trauma that went through those kids and those parents is something that'll never be erased.
People that I wanted to reach out the most and be able to assist were African migrants or black migrants coming into Mexico and not being able to have any type of assistance. All they wanted was safety and security and refuge, and they believed that the United States was a country that would provide them that.
Okay, all right, okay, let's go. So we got called back. So la otra abogada me dijo para traerla. We were denied again, which is just ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense. They have a blind person who's in the system, and they don't feel like they have to follow the law. Their own law.
President Biden on defense this morning with the migrant surge growing at the southern border.
They don't know what's happening down here. A lot of women told us that in the night, the guys try to open the tents to rape them. I'm afraid that nobody's really giving legal advice to them. They just know they're waiting, but they don't know what they're waiting for.
20-year-old girl whose mom was in the northern part of Mexico, and the girl came to find her mom to reunite with her mom, and she suffered an accident falling off the train.
Migration shouldn't end. Why should it? Human beings have migrated since the dawn of humanity. This is our basic human right.
Okay, can you bring up the last slide? Thank you. So we're waiting on word from the Guanajuato Film Festival. Hopefully we'll be showing the film this summer through the film festival. If not, or even if so, we've had invitations from another nonprofits in town to show it here in the fall. So you'll have a chance to see the movie. And I think it's sometimes overwhelming to see the scale of the problem, but there's also a lot of hope. And in this movie, you'll see the stories of some asylum seekers that these lawyers were able to help get across the border who desperately needed it. I always like to end these kinds of presentations, and that was very fast, and I'm happy to take questions, but I like to end by talking about ways that you can help, because it does seem like an overwhelming problem, and what can any person do? There are small things you can do. If you're still a U.S. voter, of course you can vote for people that are in favor of immigration reform. And by the way, I don't really see this as a partisan issue. I mean, historically, you think about the latest big immigration reform bill we had, it was in 1986 under Reagan. And then the most recent border restriction type bill we had was under Clinton. So it's not a Republican or Democratic issue. We need workers in the United States, right? We need immigration. We have a falling birth rate. We have 11 million jobs that are unfilled now. We only have something like 4 million job seekers. If we don't have immigration, the United States population will fall, the economy will fall. It seems obvious to me, and I also spent most of my career in an employment-based immigration practice where we were helping workers to come into the United States to fill jobs. So it seems obvious to me, but it's not obvious to everybody. But in terms of things you can do, of course, the Latin American Relief Fund, and full disclosure, I am a board member, but as you know, the Latin American Relief Fund funds the operations of the ABBA House shelter in Celaya, and that's a really concrete thing you can do to help right here at home near San Miguel. You can also donate to Stan Allen's GoFundMe. As I said, he raises money, he buys food and clothing and backpacks and all sorts of wonderful things. There's this wonderful organization called Miles for Migrants that we discovered on our film team when we were helping Giselle, that young woman who lost her legs, and her mother, who I talked about at the Unitarian service. Some of you were there. When we helped them come into the United States under a humanitarian parole, we discovered that Miles for Migrants will provide airline tickets anywhere within the United States for migrants. So if you have frequent flyer miles that you're not using, you can donate them to Miles for Migrants. I think it's tax deductible. They're a nonprofit. They don't just give them away willy-nilly. They partner with other nonprofits that are working with migrants. But they will then help people. You cross Texas, but you have to get to New York or California or Chicago. That's a long trip for people with no money. They will provide plane tickets. So that's a wonderful way you can help. And I have the URL for our documentary because we have a page on our website that has links to other nonprofits and other things that you can do to help migrants, even to the extent of helping some people in the film, helping individual people, like the young woman who needs a new wheelchair or who needs a lawyer for her asylum application. So these are just 4 of many different ways that you could help, but I would encourage you to do what you can. So thank you. I'll stop now and take any questions. I saw a hand up right over there.
Anyone have a question? Yeah. 2 questions for you. One, you hold it for me. 2 questions. One, how does someone become a sponsor in the U.S. to help someone? And number 2, what is Mexico doing to help with asylum or visas or something?
Okay, the first question is you can go on to, I should have provided the URL. I can send some links that can be distributed to the membership if you like. But you can go onto the website of the Department of Homeland Security and you can apply to be a sponsor. And there's a larger sponsorship program too that's just being rolled out called welcome.us. It's not just Ukrainians and the members of citizens of the other countries I mentioned, where people in a community can get together. They want, I think, at least 5 people together in a community to act as a sponsor for a migrant individual or family and help them get settled. So that's one way you can help. What's Mexico doing? Mexico, I should have mentioned earlier, has been offering humanitarian visas to migrants that allows them to stay in Mexico and decide if they want to apply for asylum, for example. Mexico is accepting asylum applications from migrants, and that is happening. And Pastor Ignacio, as you may or may not know, has recently become a lawyer. So he's helping people through the legal process as well. He saw that that was a need, and he decided that he would try to fill that.
Gate in federal court, what is the percentage that the government wins their cases?
99.9%. I mean, and that's off the cuff, I'm not sure exactly. But certainly during the last few years, in terms of immigration hearings that these migrants were going through, there was like a 1% approval rate in some locations. Once you're in the United States, it also depends on where you land because, you know, we're a very divided country up there, right? And if you go to the immigration court in San Francisco, you're going to have a pretty good chance of having your asylum claim approved in the context of your deportation hearing. If you go to North Carolina, it's kind of an asylum-free zone where almost nobody is getting asylum. So when I was meeting people in Dilley and Carnes, the family detention camps in Texas, and I would hear where they were planning to go. Well, I have a family member in North Carolina. I'm like, are you sure you don't know anybody in New York or in California? You're going to have a much better chance.
So, two questions. One, the U.S. lets in about 800,000 people a year legally. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you think is the right number. How many people a year should the U.S. let in? And of the people that are in that have court dates, what percentage of people actually show up for their court dates?
Okay, those are great questions. Yeah, so it fluctuates between about 800,000 and 1 million a year legal immigrants that come into the United States. And that's been the case for many, many years. I think there's always more demand than that. There's a kind of artificial limit based on how quickly the government can process cases. That seems to be about the right number. I mean, there must be a reason why it's kind of landed there over the years. It's what we can absorb. And those are mostly people coming in through family ties, so they have a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident family member who's sponsoring them, or in a few cases, they might have an employer sponsoring them for a green card. I think we need more. I think that we should maybe let the market talk in this case. Like I was saying before, we have a lot of jobs that need to be filled. We don't have enough people to fill them. The problem is that the employment-based immigration program is minuscule. Out of that million that you mentioned, 800,000, there are only 140,000 visas available each year for employment-based immigrants. That's a drop in the bucket. We need more. And we need what I would call an essential workers program. Most of the work visas that are available now are for people with advanced degrees and professional skills. And we have jobs in construction and agriculture and healthcare that are not getting filled because you don't need to have an advanced degree for a lot of those jobs, but there's no pathway in our legal system to allow people to come in. What was your second question again?
Out of the people that get court dates, how many actually show up?
Oh, you know, the majority do show up. Contrary to popular belief, something like 90% would show up.
I wonder why are we not, or why are they not designated as refugees? I mean, they're certainly refugees from Guatemala and countries like that.
That's a great question. You're right. They should be designated refugees. They are, in fact, refugees. And I should have mentioned that, you know, under the Trump administration, that refugee resettlement program was decimated. In his last year in office, he had brought the limit down to 10,000. You think of the, you know, 1 million or so legal immigrants that we have every year, only 10,000 refugees were allowed to come in. Biden has raised that number. I think it's 125,000 now, but nowhere near that number have been let in. But I mean, that's a good question. That's a policy issue, and I would agree with you that we should expand our definition of who qualifies as a refugee. There had been a program, a short-lived program, a Central American program, where people could apply from their home country to come in, not as refugees, but as quasi-refugees, but that's kind of died. Yeah?
What can be done to change the optics so that Americans see these people as offering positive economic and human potential? Because I think that's the main problem people live in fear of. Mm-hmm. It's just a mass of problematic people that are going to be allowed in. So there needs to be a message through to show what can happen with these people when they get into the country, fit into the community, and work. And I think that's all missing. So people are just very, very frightened that it's just a wave of problematic people who are going to be a burden. So I think the optics need to shift. What are the barriers, or what can be done to help other people see that they could be a positive? And America's always received immigrants and needed immigrants, and we've grown that way.
I couldn't agree more. I'm getting the time signal, so I'm going to cut it short, but I couldn't agree more. Our movie is a small effort at humanizing the people that we think of as just this mass. I think the government could do more to perpetuate positive images of immigrants. And there are lots of nonprofits that are trying to do that as well. I think I need to stop now. Thank you very much. Oh.